Good afternoon. Everyone looks so fresh and ready for this. I tried with my title to keep you awake. So, Catherine always says that I have good titles. So I hope this one is not too confusing. So I'm going to take us all to Bosnia in a slightly different way from what I heard from the last panel and the approach that the panelists had to different regions of the world and different topics. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so most of my work is informed from poetics of everyday life. So that's how I'm going to enter the field. I have to do this sometimes. I know that people in this room know where Bosnia is, but one insider thing that you can take from me, I'm from Bosnia, if you didn't detect the accent, is that Bosnians themselves believe that Bosnia is a heart-shaped land in the middle of Europe. It's not heart-shaped, it's not in the middle of Europe. But don't tell them. When they tell you that, you just nod and it's going to work out. So for most of my research, does this take me? I don't see it. No, I don't want to go to the next one, but I want to. Okay, so most of my research historically was located in Mostar. And currently I'm doing research in this region, Canton 10. So I'm going to take you there for this particular piece. So just a little bit about Bosnia. I know the majority of people remember, but just to refresh everybody's memory, and I know I have some students in the audience, and I know that they probably do not necessarily know these details about Bosnia. Bosnian War lasted between part of the larger Yugoslav dissolution and lasted between 92 and 95. It's often described in literature as a conflict between Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslims. I think that's simplification of the conflict itself, but I deal with that in my other work. I'm not going to touch upon that right now. And it claimed what scholarship now suggests is 104,000 lives, and 2 out of 4 million people were uprooted. Some of them actually to Syracuse. 3,000 of Srebrenica refugees ended up in Syracuse. So just a piece of information. That's where I get my Bosnian food from. So Dayton Peace Agreement was, as some of you know, it was prepared in Dayton, Ohio, but signed in a much cooler place called Paris on December 14, 95. And it's a site of creation of consortiational model of democracy in Bosnia, which institutionalized ethnic segregation and ethnic territorialization of people. And it created and institutionalized ethnicity at the sub-state level. It created Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which takes 51% of the territory and which is in itself divided into 10 cantons. Republika Srpska, which is pretty much centralized and takes 49% of the territory, and then the Brčko district, which is neutral, self-governing administrative unit. In addition to this it actually created a bureaucratic nightmare, where in some instances there are 13 levels of government. So extremely complicated bureaucratic structure of peace. Bosnia, oftentimes, what's interesting about Bosnia in relation to other parts of the former Yugoslavia, that it's often not described as post-socialist. And that's a problem. Post-socialism is often bracketed from mostly from academic discussions, but the effects of post-socialism are so visible, and it's so importantly shape people's lives. So, this is another unfinished, I don't use the word transition, I find it really inaccurate. Another transformation that Bosnia is undergoing is this change from former communist regime to something. It's called democracy, but I'm not sure that we can really say it fully fits that description. So from socialism to post-socialism, and this process is started actually during the war, when in 1994, while Bosnia was still in the midst of extreme forms of violence, the parliament made a law to transform all collective workers' property to state property. And then that state property since then has been slowly privatized, sometimes not so slowly, very unsuccessfully in terms of the procedures themselves and transparency, and successfully in terms of certain people making fortune out of the process. So many of these nationalist elites who are leading the country and have been leading the country since the beginning of the war are very successfully actually engaging in this process of privatization as well. So the privatization is crooked and corrupt, and many workers, because Yugoslavia did build a significant industry during the Tito's communist time. Many of the workers found themselves caught in these processes of privatization, and they are, in local language, radnici na čekanju, or workers who are temporarily laid off. So they end up existing in this state of kind of suspended semi-employment. That's not paid. So I'm really interested in this concept of čekanje, or waiting, as a political space. And politically, I use in a very kind of broad anthropological sense of politics. I'm going to return to that. So all this double transformation, so again, Bosnia is not only post-war, it's also post-socialist. This double transformation and its many intricacies are creating a context of precarity, uncertainty, and perpetual waiting. Okay, so I wanted to see how that affects Bosnian youth. Youth, I understand, again, as an object in this particular piece of international intervention. There is so much written about Bosnian youth, and they're really literally a site of intervention, of project creation. So there are numerous reports on the state of youth, and there are mixed discourses in this report. Here, one set of discourses is almost alarming, where youth are described in terms of, there's a crisis, brain drain, young people are leaving the country, unemployment among youth at 63%, very alarming numbers. The World Bank engaged, among other organizations, they're engaged in projects of tackling youth unemployment. And recent UN report emphasized that 77% of youth would like to leave the country, never to return. So very alarming discourses of crisis among youth. On the other hand, youth are also being often described as a site of hope and future. That's the intervention, right? 250 youth-focused international projects are happening in Bosnia right now. So it's kind of confusing. Because they're both seen as a site of apathy and lethargy, as well as site of hope. These are actually pictures of students that I conducted fieldwork with in the town of Mostar in the first reunited, ethnically divided during the war school in Mostar Gymnasium, and then I looked at how these students came back together after the war through the process of internationally supervised reunification. Also, oftentimes, these reports focus on apathy among youth and how youth in Bosnia are disinterested and lost sometimes. Some teachers even describe youth to me as morally rotten, and I don't have time to unpack that. So all these discourses coexist and shape how youth are perceived by both insiders and outsiders. My ethnographic research complicates these explanations. I'm not saying that these are necessarily wrong, but I want to understand, what does it mean really to be one of 63% of unemployed youth? How is that lived, right? So I want to make sense of how they make sense of and inhibit these existential uncertainties of 63% and 77% in the context of broken and maimed society, decimated stability, and suspended daily reality. So I constructed the notion of social life of waiting. This is how I describe this social life of waiting: unique, affective, bodily, and imaginative response that youth develop in order to navigate and respond to their perplexing daily realities, such as unemployment and perceived lack of Bosnia-based future. This is not a passive thing. This čekanje or waiting, I understand as active withdrawal from here and now, almost like a preservation and hibernation in the present. This also suggests very different temporal geographies of citizenship and horizons of hope, and I'm going to come back to that. So in terms of how they've envisioned their future, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, oftentimes they talked about future as immediate future. I'm going to have coffee. I have one mark. I'm going to have a coffee with my friend. And eventually, I'm going to go to Germany. That's a typical story. But what happens in between is absent from these kinds of conversations. So a very different kind of geographical and temporal dimension of citizenship. So in order to understand this, I went to this town that I call Bijelo Brdo. It's in Unasana Canton. It's a small town of 4,000 people that has been quite impacted by the war, and it's located close to the war-produced entity line that separates the Federation from Republika Srpska. So it's at the internal border within Bosnia. It's a mixed Serb-Muslim town. Both populations, this is actually quite unique, both populations were refugees during the war, first the Muslims and then the Serbs. So everyone is pretty much a returnee, but at different points in the war, they started their refugee saga. In the post-war space, they're coexisting, negotiating their differences and similarities. And this is quite amazing because once I shadowed a group of policemen. Police is now unified, and they were group was of different ethnicities. However, when they socialized, they went to different coffee shops across the street from each other. Muslims drank coffee with Muslims and Serbs with Croats. So while there's coexistence in workspace, there's still separate socialization after work or during break during the work. They work together but socialize separately. And then in addition to all this post-war landscape, there is post-socialist landscape. A huge factory that has been destroyed during the war, caught in shady process of privatization, and still people are waiting for work with the same. For 20 years, they've been waiting to be returning to these positions. There are some government jobs, but also there's a lot of illicit work, especially in timber industry. Bosnia is the most forested country in Europe, 64% of the country. That's Bosnian gold now. There's a lot of interest from inside and outside around Bosnian forests. Okay, so I was then introduced, so this is a 4,000 people town, and on the outskirts of town there is a village that I visited. I visited this village called Klasovača because I read from a questionnaire I designed, I read answers from these youth that talked, I asked them, what does Bosnia and Herzegovina mean to me? And many of them responded, and most of them talked about corruption and nepotism and poverty. And they talked also about the fact, and I'm here now, that many boys my age cannot go to school because they have no money for the bus ticket. They stay at home. So I wanted to understand what does staying at home means. So I went to Klasovača, and this was my critical event. It was very eerie, pregnant with waiting. Everyone in this village was waiting. There were ruins of former industries and cultural centers. There were private homes that were reconstructed by the international money. There were men drinking in a bar. They're right there in the corner, right-hand corner, waiting. Some of them said that they were waiting for the Hague. I don't have time, but I know I'm sure you understand what I mean by that. Children waiting for a ride in front of the school. 3 young men waiting on the bench of the former bus station for the spider web to become too heavy. And then son of the cleaning lady who was showing me around, who said, I'm waiting for the papers for Germany. And I said, what will you do for the end of the day? And he said, just like this. So he is in that semi-laying, semi-erected position. So he's waiting. So I want to understand the analytical importance of waiting. And this is not totally new in anthropology. I will not go through this slide because I don't have time. But there are 2 types of waiting, as scholars in anthropology talk about today. One is emphasizing the negative, coercive side of waiting. Many bureaucracies make people wait in order to control them. It's a site of disciplining, right? So there is uncertainty that comes with waiting. There's boredom. There is government-imposed disciplining type of waiting. And then there is waiting that emphasizes the future. Derealization of the present. The only meaning lies in the future, right? Type of waiting. Anticipation is also a side of waiting. So what is my social life of waiting in Bosnia? Waiting was doing something. It wasn't just doing nothing. It was doing something. It's an active, performative practice. The young men's bodies looked suspended, almost paralyzed, as they leaned against the broken bench and blanket-covered sofa. Gendered ways in which unemployment, immobility, and political withdrawal is experienced in everyday life was channeled through waiting. At the same time, their shiny eyes, their gaze towards the bus stop or Germany, and their readiness to comment on and even laugh about their own predicament revealed the social life of hope that there is a better life elsewhere. So here, waiting is doing work of preservation. It's suspension and hibernation. It's an active stance, not necessarily a site of apathy. So, converging horizons of disappointment and hope made a young man's current immobility much more complex and tangible than what the media and Western policy reports and local newspapers revealed, and thus much heavier to bear. Non-participation in political life, they were actively withdrawing from Bosnian political life here and now, is explained as a highly complicated and agentive process unfolding simultaneously in multiple temporal and geographical spaces. What I mean by that, and I'm concluding, is that youth in Bosnia are subject to shadow economies in the shared present, temporarily displaced citizens of their elsewhere state. And this elsewhere state is described as Europe, but it's kind of imaginary, right? It's detached from actual Europe, sometimes. Sometimes it is about papers to Germany. They see either leaving the country or embracing corruption as the only two ways out of their paradox that shape their road to adulthood. Their experience of here and now, midway to democracy, felt essentially stale and immoral. To stay moral, one needs to withdraw. If you are going to survive really here and now, you have to become corrupt. That's often how they describe their predicament. These conditions strike tremendous cynicism among ordinary Bosnians about the future of the state that is ethnically segregated, economically declining, and profoundly unjust, in their opinion. This creates a sharp distinction between here, seen as a morally corrupt Bosnian democratization, when one has to withdraw from the state, and that's why I call Bosnia an empty state, and its dirty politics in order to survive. You have to be an anti-citizen in other ways. And there, imagined as a site where moral rules are more or less in place, and where a person can choose not to engage in corrupt behavior and still be recognized and respected democratic citizen. So the product of this social helix, among other things, is a stance of anti-citizenship, which is an active stance via waiting. Political hibernation in the contaminated present, which includes waiting for better times to arrive, and a related aspiration to leave the state under any circumstance. That's it.